Good afternoon, Varda. How are you?
Very well, thanks very much. How about you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you again and to record this for a wider audience because we had a fascinating conversation with Sanchita and Chaitanya Talreja, previous guest, just to sort of introduce ourselves and the work we were doing. We zeroed in on, I guess, both the challenges of the nature of just transitions in the global south and ideas about a sort of sentientist economics that would bring ideas of sentientism into the economics world. But it's going to be great to spend some one-to-one time with you now to understand your philosophical journey and the things you're doing now to try and make a better future. So as you know already, this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions, the epistemological question of what's real and what's true, but also the ethical questions of what matters and who matters. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which in a sentence is evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So suggest we take a naturalistic approach to the what's real question. And when it comes to the question of moral scope, the clue is in the name that we should grant moral consideration and have compassion for all sentient beings, regardless of species or substrate. But in this series, I'm talking to people who both agree with different aspects of that, but might also disagree. So it's going to be really interesting to know your own story. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Thanks for that, Jimmy. I think, I've always identified myself as an activist first, an activist for animals. I've done lots of grassroots organizing in Scotland, where, I was involved with, of course, primarily the animal rights movement. But I also got involved in lots of other struggles that were also going on. There was the big G8 that was happening in Scotland that time. So there was a lot that was happening. And that really sort of, so the intersectional thinking really got shaped up, by being a part in practice, in those other struggles. And for the last 10 years, I've been, doing animal advocacy work in India. I primarily worked on farmed animals, but also companion animals, wild animals, policy work, mobilization, vegan advocacy, campaign, undercover investigations, corporate engagement, sort of like the sort of campaigning that most animal advocacy organizations undertake to advance the interests of animals. And then about, I think 1.5 to 2 years ago, we sort of, a few of us started feeling that we needed a more intersectional approach. We needed a bigger picture approach to respond to the challenges that we are facing today and really correcting the omission of animal interests in the broader discourse around our planetary crisis. So that's when a few of us set up Samayu, the organization that I'm currently working with, to advance animal interests, but with a more intersectional, with a broader lens, sort of really making it more, getting out of that well of just talking about animal interests in a vertical, but really acknowledging and working with the interlinkages that exist that we all know of. And if anything, then COVID has shown us that. So that's what I'm doing just now.
Brilliant. Thank you. And it'll be great to dig into that when we come on to our final question about making a better world. But before we go there, let's start with these really basic but quite tricky philosophical questions. And the first one of those is, what's real? So many of my guests tell a story about whether they grew up originally in a more spiritual or a mystical or a religious context, or one that was maybe more naturalistic, maybe atheistic, maybe scientifically minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time about how you think about the nature of the universe, what's true, what's real, and how do we go about working the answers out. So you can start the story wherever you feel comfortable.
Sure. I mean, I think like, many folk, I guess, I did have a religious upbringing, but my father worked with the government in the forest department. So so many of our weekends, I mean, pretty much all our holidays were spent in the forest, and I think one of the things that I'm most grateful for is that at a very young age, I was sort of like really exposed to not the importance, because the importance even diminishes the value of the natural world, but, really how you hold it in wonder, I mean, really at a young age, being able to hold nature in wonder and really sort of falling in love with that. Even before I had the vocabulary to identify that. But, so I think that was always a very sort of consistent part, to value, to understand the importance of the world in which we live in, the natural world in which we live in. And my mom, she used to work as a Buddhist researcher. So she did a lot of research in Buddhist philosophy. So, even though it was sort of like a traditional Hindu upbringing, there was a lot of Buddhist sort of concepts mixed in with that, and a very sort of an appreciation for nature, So I think I was very fortunate in the environment I grew up in sort of being more, perhaps, more connected and more aware of things outside the sort of the focus of Hindu religion on its own, that was really good. Of course, over time, as any rebellious teenager, I was a staunch atheist for a while,
Oh, yeah.
But I think now the question of sort of atheism has almost disappeared, and I think now it's sort of like not so much, and I don't even have a position on that, if, it just ceased to matter. And I think over time,
in that teenage stage, what was it that led you to an atheist stance over and above just the rebellion thing? What was your pattern of thought? Because some of my guests talk about ethical challenges they see within some religious worldviews. For others, it's more about facts and evidence, and just doesn't feel true to me anymore, or something else. I'm quite interested in that teenage journey and how it was received.
Yeah, I think evidence, I just didn't see any evidence or any basis of rationality, I just sort of did not see it, could not believe it, it just didn't, I just couldn't, there was just no way I could relate to faith, on its own, which is what was sort of like the consistent, not even argument, but just the belief system, that there's just no evidence, and especially sort of like the very dogmatic side of religion, I think that I still strongly disagree with, I don't think that's, of course, faith serves a lot of purpose in, supporting people, faith is important, I respect that. But I think dogma is certainly something that I'm not sure how that helps. I wasn't then, I wasn't convinced then, I'm not convinced now. And it was really based on the lack of evidence that and rationality, and I think even now, even though my worldview has shifted, I don't believe in the single or multiple male gods that exist, and I that's just not, even though I don't identify as an atheist, I just identify as a nothingist, I don't have any belief around God, but yeah, certainly not the stereotypical male god, the single male god in some religions, or the multiple male gods and goddesses that we may have in others. So that's really where that came from.
Yeah, thank you. And was that a difficult process to go through as a rebellious teenager? How did your parents and wider society respond to that? Or was it just a sort of ordinary teenage rebellion thing and you just sort of got on with it?
Yeah, I think that was like one of the many things that I was sort of like doing or talking about differently. I come from lots of my family was, would eat meat and consume dairy. And the dairy was not even on my radar until much later, but consume meat. And at a very young age, I sort of said, I'm not okay doing that. So, there were lots of things that I was opposing at quite, or challenging belief systems at quite a young age. So I think it sort of like all got probably lumped together as, this is just sort of
another thing on the list.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's a common theme running amongst some of my guests that they were remarkably resilient and persistent, children and teenagers on quite difficult issues, and we just got this thing in the head and stuck with it. So and it's interesting that you talked about, so you went through a sort of rebellious phase where you were quite determinedly atheistic, and it sounds like that just the urgency of that issue has faded for you somewhat, so that you're more, you're a nothingist, as you say. But there is a sense that the reverence for the natural world that you've felt since your childhood has now connected with the way you might think about these issues now. So that, as you say, there isn't a belief in the story told about a very male-looking God, pushing a sort of outmoded medieval ethics on people, you don't sign up to that. But there is some space for a sense of something transcendent or beyond the natural material world, is there? Or
yeah, I think yeah, that's true. I think over the last several years, I've sort of course, most of the focus of and the priority for my time's been working for animals. But I've sort of like also explored a lot of different modalities for mainly initially for self-connection, meditation and sort of yoga and all those things, and many other modalities. And I think sort of over the years, the interconnection, pardon me, the interconnection that we see, or the interconnection that I see, I experience it at a very practical level, and I see it in a very practical, when I talk about, animals and people and planet, and I see that play out in really sort of tangible ways. And that to me is, that to me is, that to me is evidence for just sort of like a general sense of interconnection, an interconnection. And it really comes from, and I don't like using the word compassion, but it really maybe empathy, it really comes from a space of empathy, of acknowledging that everything is interconnected. And I think that probably defines my spiritual beliefs, that it's just sort of like one. I mean, I don't think there's anything greater than, there's sort of like a greater than outside force. But certainly there's a fundamental interconnection that goes beyond, transactional sort of relationships between, different actors. And I think that's sort of a spiritual, that's really what I think grounds me. I think that's what also helps me find kindness and compassion when I may not be able to otherwise, find ways to connect, with human and non-human beings, sentient beings. So I think that's really where my spiritual beliefs, if that's the word for it, have now gone to.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the other things I find fascinating in these conversations is that I think quite a few people end up in a similar sort of position. But even there's a sort of subtle difference, because I think some people would say what you've said, and would say that part of that actually is something magical or mystical, or there is some sort of spiritual essence that goes beyond the physical world. And that's where this interconnectedness and this sense of empathy comes from. Whereas I might say very much the same things you've said, but I see that sense of interconnection and empathy as still something that's very hard-edged, naturalistic, thing that requires no mysticism. And I might be comfortable using the word spirituality, but I don't think that there are spirits that exist that are independent of the physical world. So are you sort of in either of those camps, or something between the two, or?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That's something I've been exploring for myself, my own truth for several years now. And there was certainly a phase when I was meditating for, I think, about 6 hours a day. And I sort of felt there was a, sort of like, there was a deeper, sort of, if deeper is the word that can be used, interconnection that goes beyond the material world. And I think I over time, sort of, I think I've gone from sort of one end of, sort of real living in the material world to the other, maybe not completely to the other end, but sort of like further down the spectrum of not. I think I'm now trying to find my way somewhere in the middle, and I think that's really where probably my philosophy also lies. Because I'm not sure how much of it was, sort of really my own experience, how much of it was just absorbed from all the people and the teachers and the materials and so on and so forth that I was exposed to. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I've experienced both things, and I'm still trying to. And I think that's like one of the many fundamental questions that we ask ourselves in the context of, why are we here? What are we doing to, sort of like, and I think I don't know. I'd be so excited when I find that out. But I don't know.
Fascinating, thank you. And those personal experiences, whether it's through meditation or through some other sort of experience, or with some of my guests even experimenting with psychedelics, seems to be another really fascinating turning point, because for some people, when they go through this experience, it can turn even the most hard-edged, naturalist like me to suddenly going, the world, the universe is actually radically different than I thought before. There is some other layer or other metaphysics out there or other degree of connection that I had not understood before. And it's a sort of revolutionary turn in their thinking. Whereas others, and I suspect I might be one of these boring people, but I haven't really experimented enough to find out, will go through those experiences and go, I have an enormously enriched understanding of the plasticity of the human mind, but it hasn't changed my understanding of reality, right? It's just helped enrich my understanding of the sheer variety of sentient experience. But but it's a fascinating exploration. And I think just saying, we don't know is probably the most intellectually healthy stance to take, and just keep exploring and finding out. The other thing that's
an excuse for psychedelics, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, and that's what everyone tells me is, Jamie, stop talking about this until you've tried it yourself, and then maybe the whole tone of your podcast will change, and you'll be talking about psychedelic elves and mystical powers beyond the natural realm. Maybe that'll happen one day. But I guess the other thing that I wanted to touch on quickly with you on this before we move on is one of the reasons I focus on this epistemological question is just because I think it's good to understand the world as well as we can if we want to make it better. And I think using evidence and reason in a humble way is the best approach. But the other reason is because some forms of epistemology, particularly the more dogmatic ones you mentioned, can present very clear and direct ethical risks and take even good people into doing bad things. And while there's a lot of good in the established traditional religions, nearly all of them have a sense of compassion running through them, and there's the golden rule and so on and so forth, and sometimes some quite sensible rules. Of course, there are also some exclusionary ethics and harsh punishments and some sort of strange warpings that go on. But one sense I get is that for the people I've spoken to who've gone from an established religion to a more broad sense of spirituality, it feels like there's less of a direct ethical risk from that way of thinking, because it is one that isn't about an authority figure or a list of rules you have to follow or ultimate punishments and rewards or strict social strictures that have to be followed. It is a more amorphous sense of interconnectedness and empathic connection, which seems to present to me less of a sort of risk of warping our compassionate ethics in certain ways. But having said that, there are some people who've left an established religion and gone down what they might call a spiritual path that can still lead to quite dangerous places, whether it's sort of high demand cultish behavior or scams and grifting or whatever it might be, or alternative medicines that distract people away from the medicines they actually need. So before we wrap up this section, have you got any, I'd just be interested in your observations about how the sort of this epistemological worldview, whether it's religion, spirituality, or something else, links into how we think about ethics.
Yeah, just in response to what you said, I think it's true that most folk who are maybe sort of like have a broader sense of spirituality, for the lack of a better word, beyond organized religion. There is a fundamental acknowledge of interconnections and and empathy. But I think I think there's a huge difference whether they are taking action from those beliefs or not. Lots of maybe people working for justice for different groups, whether it's environmental justice or animal or people, you can see that translate into, some sort of a new belief system. But I think lots of folk who also, and there's such a large population of folk who do have alternative beliefs beyond organized religion, but that doesn't necessarily translate. Buddhist monasteries are still serving, or not serving, but they're still, meat and dairy, and not necessarily, open to those conversations. And so many different, I think every belief system can easily be made into, can easily become dogmatic, wherever it may be on the spectrum. It could be extremely dogmatic, but everybody has their own set of rules. So I'm not too sure. I meet so many people outside the movement, any kind of movement, whether it's environmental, social, other social justice issues, animals, who are just on the spiritual path. And it's not necessary that they would, that broader sort of worldview translates to an acknowledgement of, maybe theoretically, but certainly not in, even in their own actions. Doesn't necessarily translate to a new belief system in our relationship with nature and animals. So I think there is they can become dogmatic, like you said, cult behaviors, exploiting people and other beings can certainly happen. So I'm not sure if it's really sort of that black and white. I think spirituality can be equally dark, or the alternative spiritual space can be, sometimes equally dark as organized religion, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, to complete the picture, people even with a naturalistic worldview can warp, the scientific understanding they think they have of the world to take it in very dark ethical directions as well. So there isn't, there's no guaranteed path here. Although I do have this slightly optimistic view that if you have a genuinely naturalistic way of understanding the world and you really do want to engage with the nature of reality, it does have a powerful complementarity with a compassionate ethic that doesn't exclude any sentient being. So I do think they mesh together well, but one doesn't guarantee the other by any means. Yeah. Well, let's come on to that second question of what matters and who matters. And you've hinted at this already with some of your early childhood rebellions about animal products and the work you do today, but also your focus on taking an intersectional approach as well. But maybe I'll try and break this question into two parts. When you think about what matters and the sort of the foundation of ethics, what do good and bad and right and wrong actually mean to you, and how has that changed over your life? And then we'll come on to this question of who counts and who matters and who should we have empathy and compassion for.
Yeah, I mean, I think if everybody matters, at a very simplistic level. I think all human and non-human beings matter, and I think that connects to that. That's that connects to the sort of whole interconnection. That's really what my worldview is, and I sort of feel like everybody matters, and I think each of us are on our journey to be able to put that into action. And I think it's so hard to make choices in a way that everybody's needs matter. Because we always end up, because either because of lack of information or lack of resources or lack of knowing what the alternative path is. We end up sacrificing the needs of some groups. We might sacrifice the needs of animals or nature or people, underprivileged people, and we end up doing that. But I think I think the best effort that each one of us can make is just to be I think, like you said, to be genuinely committed to that worldview and to walk that path, that all these that everybody matters. It's not I often think that the way to think about this, especially in conflict, when needs are in conflict, is to not sort of like think of it from the point of view of what's a priority. Is our if it's for example, tribal rights versus development, and it's not a question of what do we need to prioritize, but we really need to be thinking about what if we did not have to prioritize. How do we really engage with the issues, the very real problems which are very difficult to solve today if we were to look at it from the point of view of that, we don't have to choose, we don't have to prioritize, because we acknowledge that all needs do matter, and I think sentience is the scientific basis of including beings in our moral compass, and looking at that, but also beyond that, I think looking at nature and including those needs also within that moral compass, I think is critical.
Yeah, and it sounds like that sort of sense of reverence for nature and the importance of nature is carried through right from early in your childhood to now. And I guess that might extend your moral consideration beyond sentient beings to think about nature and its interconnections. At the same time, is it true to say that you do see sentience as having a distinct relevance, that capacity to experience suffering, is over and above just existing in this interconnected nature. There is still something distinctive about sentience that we should take seriously as a distinction.
Yeah, I think so. I think when we talk about sentience, we're the division is really human and non-human animals. I think there's sort of like a very very strong argument, to include non-human animals today. By different institutions that hold power today into our moral consideration. I think the one thing that I'd want to add is the importance of intrinsic value. And I think the fact that every animal has intrinsic. It's not sort of a means to an end. We don't need to improve the well-being of animals as a means to an end for us to achieve something. And I think the fact that every animal exists for his or her own, with his or her own interests and with an interest in his or her own life, and is the very fundamental basis of sentience. I think it's not including non-human animals in our moral compass just does not seem to stack up either at a scientific level or from a moral or an ethical standpoint either.
Yeah, and I think that intrinsic value perspective is deeply important, because in a way I think that's the aspiration. Right? We don't value or have empathy for or have compassion for others because they're useful to us in some transactional sense. What we're aspiring to do is valuing their experiences and their lives because they value them themselves intrinsically, independent of anything else. And I think that's partly a thing that softens. I do worry sometimes about this sense of interdependency being a moral basis, because that starts to feel a bit transactional. And I know that's not really what you mean. You mean, we are all connected. That's partly why we should care. But ultimately, we should care about even a disconnected individual because they value their own experience in its own right. Whereas other people do take this interdependency thing to be a bit more transactional. The only reason I should care about another is because of our connections. Whereas I think you're right. We care about them because they have intrinsic value in their own right, even independent of everything else. But yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a huge challenge with intersectional and interconnected thinking. We have the One Health framework, and it's always seen as sort of, we need to improve animal health to improve productivity. That's not what interconnection is about.
No.
That's just us sort of like. That's a very transactional, means to ultimately benefit ourselves. We are not really, looking at it from the point of view of well-being and from the point of view of the intrinsic value and the interest that an animal would have in protecting his or her own life or interest. And everybody matters. Like those needs matter. They may be different to our needs, but they matter. So yeah. I think there is definitely, that's spot on. There's definitely a massive risk of it just becoming a way to sanction lots of actions that ultimately just benefit human interests, and not really consider animal interests in the conversation.
Yeah, things just seem to be inexorably drawn back to that sort of anthropocentric stance, don't they? We tend to be good at that as humans. So, and I'm interested in going back to the childhood story about how you came to this recognition, because it sounds like you started out with a very direct appreciation for the wonder of nature in general, but then you also, as part of your rebellion, were pushing back on, for example, animal product consumption. So what was the process you went through there of starting to recognize the salience of non-human animals and then putting that into practice? Was it a quick and easy journey, or did the light go on, or did it take some more time to work through that?
I don't think the realization took time. I think that was sort of pretty quick and easy. I think certainly putting it into practice was, and still continues to be, Jenny, I wish I could say that every aspect of my life was, perfect, but it isn't. I think just interacting, and I always say this in the context of recognizing the intrinsic value of animals. Spend 5 minutes with a dog. That's all it takes. So it was really sort of like just a whole series of experiences, birds being slaughtered, which is, watching birds being slaughtered, that's again a very common experience that lots of people, in the movement, they would experience, especially in India, and sort of, that would be a turning point. So just a series of those experiences just really sort of made it very evident, again, at a very, very young age. I think I must have been about 11, 12, to sort of really be like, what, there's something fundamentally wrong here. We can't be doing this. And of course, the ideology, the whole sort of framework of rights and intrinsic value and all this vocabulary came later through, work and just spending hours in Scotland, actually, at grassroots activism. Every Saturday for 6 hours, I would be out having conversations with people. And that really sort of helped me fully understand, the whole framework. But the light bulb really went on just through a series of experiences and just saying, well, this is not okay. There's fundamentally something wrong here going on.
Yeah, thank you. And what sort of challenge did you find from family, friends, wider society? Because for some of my guests, they just decided and did it and pushed through those challenges. For others, they actually had quite a supportive environment around them. For others, that was, actually the social challenge was more difficult than the intellectual or the practical challenges. What were those transitions like for you?
I've never been, since I was younger to now, I've never been sort of really swayed too much by what other people have said to me about my choices. There was a lot of resistance. My own folks were supportive, but there was certainly a lot of resistance. There was a lot of, when I was younger, even when I was a teenager and older, sort of, as an adult, I would experience ridicule and, sort of like, oh, you don't eat this and, you want to do this and that, the usual sort of stuff. But it never sort of, I didn't even clock it as a, I didn't even clock it, it just sort of like, yeah, whatever, I certainly faced it, but it didn't particularly faze me. Like I said, my folks have been really supportive throughout the journey. And I'm sure that maybe somewhere that must have been a huge sense of relief for me, even though I've never really connected with that so much. But I think having sort of fundamental support, probably sort of like helps, pardon me, be more resilient,
Yeah.
But it does come. Of course it comes.
Yeah, thank you. So we've answered what's real, and I think I'd try and summarize your view of saying, look, you take a broadly naturalistic approach using evidence and reason to work things out, but that approach leaves you open-minded about the ultimate nature of reality and whether there is something sort of beyond the strictly naturalistic that may connect us all, and so you're open-minded about that. And then when it comes to this question of who matters, you have this rich sense of interconnectedness and a reverence for nature writ large, but that sentience has a particular role in identifying individuals that matter intrinsically in their own right, and that should be the basis for our empathy. Is that a sort of reasonable summary for, I think, how you answer those two questions?
That's spot on. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So let's come on to this final question, and this is arguably just as hard and probably even more complex, which is how can we make a better future? And you've had such an amazing history in grassroots activism, in building networks of advocates, in driving institutional change, thinking about intersectionally. So I'm fascinated in terms of the big picture with what do you think is the best way of trying to make a better world? And then it would be great to dig into some of the more specific challenges that you face in trying to do that, particularly in the Indian context.
Sure. I think, I've always believed that from a very tactical perspective, since you mentioned all these sort of like specific tactics to, towards animal justice, I think everything's important, and I think it's sort of like a whole system that we are working to influence. And, I think each of those tactics are needed, so I don't feel that, this one's more important than that. I think they all contribute to each other. I think it would be a shame if, one wasn't focused on. And I'm really I feel really grateful to other advocates who are doing other kind of work that I'm not, because that frees me up to do the work that I am doing, So I think all those tactics are hugely important. But I think at a broader level, an indicator would be I think what we really want to see is shifting public consciousness and shifting public relationship with animals. I think there was a vote in, I think it was Denmark, a few months ago, whether there should be a ban on battery cages, and I think those are the sort of things that, that was lost, but those are the sort of things that indicate that there is a shift, that people are starting to acknowledge that all needs matter, that other needs matter besides our own, and I think it's really sort of like working towards. And those shifts are not going to come about by simply just going and talking to people and doing endless outreach, or simply by doing policy work. And I think all of these different levers need to be used to make that shift. Different institutions of power need to we need to have a narrative with them. We need to have conversations with them to sort of bring about better policies and so on. And we need to also engage with the public to talk about these different issues. And the goal is really to work towards a broader public shift, in our relationship, because I think until that happens, anything else is stopgap. It's really sort of plugging gaps to alleviate immediate suffering of animals. How do we change this fundamental relationship that people have of exploitation with animals just now?
Yeah, thank you. And I wholeheartedly agree, because it strikes me that there are some world problems we're facing where the real challenge is a technical one. Someone needs to invent something else, or we need a different type of technology, or we need a different process or a different way of governing things. Whereas in the non-human animal space, and I'd argue many of the intersectional human challenges that we're facing too, it does seem to be one of, public consciousness and culture and social norms and political will. So the problem is more of psychology and sociology and politics than it is technically, because as you mentioned earlier on, you've already said one of your approaches, instead of trying to prioritize X or Y, sometimes with a different way of thinking, we might actually be able to do both. There can be win-win situations that are staring us in the face, and they certainly are when it comes to non-human animal ethics, right? There are some obvious solutions that are good for non-human animals, for humans, and for the planet we all share. And it's just a question of public consciousness. That means we're not, we're choosing not to do these really obviously technically quite easy things. And I also like that pluralistic approach of saying, because it's a consciousness problem, we can't, there's no one magic lever we can pull. We almost sort of need to pull all of the different levers at once, institutional, individual, and cultural and social, and because we've got a big consciousness shift challenge in front of us. Yeah.
Because it is. I mean, what we are, it's not just about improving the welfare of hens or cows or pigs or dogs or, any animal. It's really about fundamentally, talking about a shift in how we're relating to animals, and we're relating to animals in so many ways, and so many different actors are doing that. The government is, the courts are, producers, consumers, there's so many, each of them have different needs, each of them have different motivations, different challenges. So to sort of like think that, okay, well, if I just get some policies changed, or if I just speak to enough people and change consumption patterns, or if I just get producers to improve, it's sort of, yes, of course, that is huge wins for animals. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't, it doesn't sort of like change the fundamental way that we look at animals, the way, the narrative that we have with animals. And I think that to me is really the big thing that we need to be working towards, sort of like causing that fundamental, or working towards that fundamental shift, from exploitation to really recognizing intrinsic value. And I know, I'm not talking about undertaking campaigns for advocating for rights of animals. I know there's some organizations doing excellent work on that, and I fully support it. But really, even in the way that we think about strategy and tactics, the long-term goal needs to be a more fundamental shift, and not just, sort of a policy that's changed, or some consumers' behavior or producers' behavior that's changed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that leads into the sort of often fiery debate about advocacy tactics. And for me, the essence is about keeping our minds on that end goal of the mindset shift, the deep fundamental change we need to make. So if there are more incremental things we're trying to do, or if there are different arguments we're trying to use that relate to human well-being, or the interdependencies you talked about before, I think those can be helpful as long as they're taking us in the direction of that mindset shift. Whereas the risk is, as you were saying, that when you're thinking about, welfare improvements or certain other incremental tactics, rather than leading us towards the end goal of that fundamental mindset shift, they can end up being dead ends or distractions or taking us away from it, because a welfare intervention might actually be primarily about helping the humans feel better, not about actually respecting the intrinsic value of the beings that are still being exploited and harmed. So that makes a lot of sense to me. There's like plurality of tactics and diversity of tactics, but we've got to ultimately have our eyes on that end goal, and that will hopefully help us avoid some of the dead ends and problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm personally quite forgiving even towards distractions and dead ends. It's a long journey, and it would be naive to think that we wouldn't go through that, as a movement. I don't judge tactics too harshly. It's we don't know. We frankly don't know, and these debates have been going on for years in the movement, it's just sort of like, and so much time and energy just goes into trying to decide what's the right tactic when we honestly don't know. And I think we just need to support all, and have that solidarity, with all sorts of all the different streams, within the movement.
I agree. So there's two things that I'd be fascinated to get your view on here, and this might be too much to do, but I don't know if you can bring them into one answer and sort of use India as a case study of the sort of transitions and the consciousness shifts we'd love to drive. Because on the one hand, there's this challenge of thinking about the non-human animal issue as a vertical strip in its own right, versus thinking about it more intersectionally as another integrated social justice cause, for example. So that's one challenge, and I think so far still a missed opportunity, but it's one that more and more people are recognizing and turning to now. But the other one is just the recognizing the global diversity of the different situations in different countries and different cultures as well. And of course, there's the classic trope of many people just sort of assuming the UK or the US or the wherever they happen to live just is how the whole world is, and that's clearly breathtakingly naive. So there's this sense that we have to recognize the diversity of different approaches that might be needed because of the context of different countries and regions and cultures. So given both of those two challenges, it would be fascinating to know how you think about India in its breathtaking complexity, given its scale and diversity, when we're thinking about the non-human animal question and the questions of intersectionality, and how should people think about approaching that challenge? Again, sort of big picture.
Absolutely. I think the movement that we have in India just now is very dominated by the global north, the tactics, the narrative. It's really sort of, for many reasons, it's very dominated by the global north. I think one of the massive missed opportunities is the inherent recognition in India and several Asian countries of this integration. I think if you remove this, if you remove the sort of I'm an animal rights supporter for sure, but if you were to remove the sort of concepts and the narrative that we've taken from the global north, there is a fundamental interconnection that you find within the Indian discourse on nature and animals and people, whether it is through religion, whether it is through spiritual thinking, whether it is through cultural, orientation. And I think for many reasons, I think we've missed that opportunity. We've missed the opportunity to really engage with what is. This interconnection is already acknowledged in the culture, in the thinking in India and lots of Asian countries. But this is sort of, unfortunately, this is not something that's been really explored, at least not in the Indian movement, and also in the Indian movement, because animals Especially cows hold a certain position, which is really political right now. And it's, cows just get weaponized, for all sorts of oppressions. And, I think everybody sort of steers clear of, of religion, but also the fundamental worldview that India has, towards or the Indian culture has towards animals and nature and its more integrated thinking. I think missing that and not really having a language to put it in today's context. The language we have for that is ahimsa and sort of lots of concepts that are older, that are archaic. Ahimsa is not archaic, but lots of the language is archaic and doesn't appeal to the youth, the thinkers of now. That's sort of like not really that's not really sort of received attention that it perhaps deserves in being able to advance animal interests and the interconnections that we see. There's certainly, I think there's a lot of work to be done there because, intersectionality, in my view, is the way forward. We cannot advocate for animals by not acknowledging the interlinkages that exist with, so many other actors. And I think there's a lot to be done to be able to tap into what is inherently already here, but it's just sort of like we've neglected it because A, it's too political, and B, we are sort of like working with the narrative of the global north for many decades now.
And it's frustrating how that sort of importing of the global north's perspective has not only doesn't necessarily fit the current cultural challenges you're facing, but also ignores that wealth of perspective that exists, in various parts of Indian and Asian cultures already. It's like a massive missed opportunity. And I come across this sense in many conversations where a lot of people genuinely seem to think that animal ethics was invented in Victorian England, or was invented even later than that by Richard Ryder and Peter Singer and, Tom Regan and so on. It was just, this amazing new idea. It's breathtakingly illiterate in terms of just the history of ideas and language, and this idea of caring about non-human animals in some intrinsic way is ancient and has roots in many, many different cultures, and particularly those that influence modern day India. So it's a frustrating missed opportunity. But I think, and your point about intersectionality, I think has a different flavour in India as well, and I'd guess in the global south, because in the global north it has a different context, I think, because it tends to be, okay, here's the animal issue and the non-human animal issue, and we have these other issues of feminism and anti-racism and other things we're trying to work on in the human sphere, and should they relate, and how do they relate, and how does that work as just a portfolio of ideas and initiatives or causes, and should they be integrated? Should we think about them in the same way? Whereas that's a question, I guess, in the Indian context as well. But the context, again, is different, because there maybe are some more potentially conflicting things going on. Because if you look with a purely human lens at India, and you look at the ongoing development of the country and people haltingly but progressively, getting a bit better off and living conditions improving. And as you look at, to some degree, the country, despite some of the current political challenges, getting a bit more secular and maybe younger people becoming less religious, something that, given my interests, I think is a good thing, because I think those people are more likely to understand the world accurately. But that development trend and that sort of secularization or getting less religious trend in isolation will tend to drive behavior and institutions down the global north route when it comes to how we treat non-human animals. So it strikes me that there is even more difficult challenge facing many places of the global south, because you're looking at a development context and a secularization context that may actually play against the non-human animal cause.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because now, with lots of younger folk, it's seen as archaic. These ideas are seen as archaic. They're seen as sort of, and the actual and a lot of it did become dogmatic religion. And it did translate to that. But the fundamental sort of thinking behind it has we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. So the idea of ahimsa itself may have lost credibility because of other dogmatic propositions that a particular religion were pushing. So yeah,
absolutely. And we've got such a rich history of this thinking influencing so many social justice movements. I mean, non-violence, Gandhi's non-violence, the Chipko movement, where they go and hug the trees, and even in more recent past, the very well-known judgment, Nagaraja sort of banning Jallikattu in India by the Supreme Court. All of these have a fundamental connection back to this thinking of interconnection, beyond just the transactional sort of like, if we look after the animals, they will be better for us, but really sort of like a deeper recognition that these interests are not separate, that we need to, that multiple beings matter. But somehow that's just getting lost, and I think the movement now is less and less, the animal movement at least, is less and less connected to some of these ideas that we've had forever, but now they're just sort of not really in our narrative anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a shame. And there are certain parts of, I guess, those historical, cultural, and religious narratives that I think it makes sense to look at skeptically. So, as my amateurish understanding of some aspects of the Hindu perspective on cows, for example, ultimately is more driven by ideas of spiritual purity and a sense of the sacred than they are an empathy for the cows themselves, as you can see in the way often they end up being treated. So there are certain contexts where you look at something with this simplistic mindset and go, well, surely cows being sacred is good for the cows, and you dig a bit deeper and you want to take that a different way. But on the other hand, there are concepts like ahimsa, which very simply is just do no harm to any being that can be harmed. It's pretty powerful and pretty central, and that should be a really rich resource to tap into to help with this consciousness shift. So yeah, it's frustrating that's difficult to do.
I think looking at it from a sort of like a crisp philosophical lens than a religious lens, I think there are lots of religious practices and lots of ideas got translated into sort of more dogmatic religious practices, which I think definitely do not have a place. And I think animals just get weaponized, like I said. But I think really looking at the fundamental philosophical ideas that, sort of resulted in some of these things, I think there's a lot of merit in being able to do that. And also being able to, I think the work that we need to do in the movement in India and perhaps other parts of Asia is to really put that in today's context. Just with the example of veganism, that's nobody can know. That's a very global north idea, and we all. That's what we're advocating for. We're advocating for veganism or plant-based diets or whatever you want to call it. But it's not really situated in the thinking that exists in the larger cultural context in India and Asia. And I think we need to do that. I think the movement in Asia and India definitely needs to contextualize lots of these things in a way that makes sense, in a way that relates to the existing worldviews of people in Asia and India. I think that's a major task.
Yeah, makes sense. And how can the intersectional approach that you take help appreciate those specific contexts? Because again, as another contrast, in a way, it's quite easy for me to sit here in London and point at an industrial factory farm and condemn it as a horrific evil and say we should just shut it down. But that's a very different context from going into a local fishing community in Kerala and telling them they all need to go vegan and and shut down their livelihoods, right? These are worlds apart in that context. And I think writ large, again, if you look at animal agriculture as one of the central problems that I think we all want to solve in somewhere like the UK, the US, or Europe, you actually have a very small number of people, percentage of people involved directly in those industries because of their industrialization. Whereas in India, still a very large proportion of the population are involved in various forms of agriculture, including animal agriculture. So it has just a different level of scale and embeddedness and local importance, even for, sustenance and survivability than it does in global North context. So how does that intersectional approach you take sort of help you think about in context like those, what would a just transition for India look like, and how can you push it forward?
Yeah, I think sort of like, the one thing is to not have the idea that we're only sort of, that we just care about animal interests and we don't really care about what happens to the farmers or, like I said, we as animal advocates, we need to, of course, animals are, we represent animals, we make sure that animal interests matter. But at the same time, we are also including other interests, we're not sort of going in with engagement, language, solutions in which we don't care about what happens to anybody else or any other actor, but just just shut down the farm, because that's I think that's not realistic. At least in my experience, I've not found that to be a realistic goal. And also because it's sort of like, as animal advocates, we always talk about, well, have empathy towards non-human beings and, but we need to reverse it also. We need to have empathy for human beings, involved in these spaces. And, it's not like the small farmers are making lots of profit, they're facing equal hardships. And I think to really go in, at least the approach that we found, in engaging with different actors here in India, is that really going in with that openness and that commitment that we are not just here to, somehow save animal lives, but we do consider all interest, as important. I think that's really helped pave the way for, to multiple kinds of actors who we wouldn't have traditionally been able to work with. It's been hugely beneficial, and I think it just goes with recognizing that all needs matter. And I think when we go with that openness, we receive it. We receive it, and we're able to sort of make it take baby steps, towards it. But I think that's the fundamental bridge building work that needs to happen.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess there's probably at least two massive challenges in terms of animal agriculture in India. One might be trying to avoid following the global north down the path of mass scale factory farming, industrialization of animal agriculture, and just adding that on. And that's a very present risk given the development trajectory of places like India and other places in the global south. So I guess that's one thing is, are there ways of heading off that sort of mass industrialization path? But then you've also got this much more sensitive challenge of thinking about whether there might be transition paths for, non-industrialized agriculture too. I think one thing that still is neglected is this idea of a just transition and how to make that work. A transition that works not just for the animals, but works for all the human sentience involved too. Generally, it's still neglected, but more work is being done on that. But again, a lot of that is still being driven from a global north perspective. And some of that, even there, is still very simplistic. So, this idea of let's take a dairy farm and say, put the cows into a sanctuary and grow oats instead. It's like, well, I like that idea and I enthusiastically support the concept, but actually the practicalities have to work, right? There still has to be a livelihood there. There still has to be the demand. You still got to work through how to make that happen. Again, in the Indian context, one, what do you think about this challenge of fighting off or heading off this aping of the global north's industrialization of animal agriculture? Is there a realistic prospect there? And two, what do you think about the range of transitions that might be available even for the non-industrial agriculture over the long term?
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity in India for sure, because I think there's so much hardship. The farmers, especially the small farmers, and even the mid-sized farmers, they're struggling so much, and for them, it's really about finding ways of finding livelihood that's dignified, that meets their needs. So I think, at least in the conversations that we've been having with some groups of farmers, we've received a positive response, in the willingness to explore whatever makes their life better. It's not sort of that, oh no, we are poultry farmers and we will continue to do poultry farming. And I think ultimately it needs to be systemic. Ultimately, if we want a shift in farming, if we want some sort of diversification to happen away from animal agriculture, it's got to be farmer led. It's got to be government led. I mean, it can't be led by animal organization, because the scale just would not have. It just wouldn't have any impact. We need to shift the larger system. Which is why the approach that we're taking towards this is to really engage with farmers and engage with the government, really try and understand what sort of schemes, subsidies, market forces, policies would provide that practical, context-specific, diversification option or options for farmers to be able to make that shift in a way that it is better for farmers. Unless it's good for farmers, it's not going to be at a scale that has any impact, So that's really sort of, I think that's really quite critical to look at it from that lens.
Yeah. And you've talked about in your engagements with farmers, you've got a positive response because you're taking this open-minded approach of starting with their interests as well. You're not just going in to tell them what they're doing is wrong. What sort of response are you getting both at state level and national level from government agencies and policymakers in general? Is there an openness to the agenda, or how does that feel? How hopeful are you?
I think at this stage, there is general sort of there's this general tolerance, I would say, because it's we are sort of promoting a world where there's farmer interests, there is environmental benefit, and of course animal interests. So I think there's general tolerance for that. I mean, there's no closed doors. I can put it that way, maybe. But it's, it's not like at this stage we have, the government super excited about it either, because animal agriculture is just such a big industry. I think unless we are able to really sort of in practice, and I think with intersectionality, that's been one of the things really very central to the work that we do at Samayu, is to really make sure that it's in practical action, because intersectionality can just become so easily just a rhetoric, So we really want to make sure that we're able to sort of show that, well, this is what it looks like. This is how it actually can work, and it's practical manifestation. And I think once we have that, I'm fingers crossed, I'm hopeful. But we're encouraged by the fact that there's certainly more openness from different political and sort of actors from the bureaucracy that we've engaged with to our message, compared to when we were sort of going in just as animal advocates. There's certainly been experience more openness for sure. Because we go with a more open mind to engage with farmers and government and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's encouraging. So the intersectional approach is one philosophically, I think, better grounded because it recognizes the interests of all the sentients, humans and not, but it's also practically, proving useful strategically and tactically in trying to drive the change you want to drive as well. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly, it's and I think this is, for so many years, I felt like we would always go into the same meetings with the same people talking about how animals should not be exploited. And it's really refreshing to not be preaching to the choir anymore, to really sort of like, sit with people and to have these discussions and drive change where it matters, where not only to the converted. So I think that was sort of something that I really appreciated very early on with the kind of actors that we're engaging with.
Yeah, no, I love that approach, and I think it's partly reflected in why I'm trying to drive this sentientism idea, because it isn't just an animal thing; it's all sentient beings, humans included. Because it does feel like there's this sense that if it's just an animal topic, it is so easy for everybody just to put you in that box and ignore you and say, well, okay, we understand what they're going to say before they've even said it. We know where they're coming from. It's a niche issue. We've got human issues to focus on. So let's just ignore it. And even in that context, animal specific things are building credibility and making some progress, but it's still always on the side. Whereas I do love this idea of just taking an integrated approach and saying, look, we should care about and have compassion for and have empathy for all sentient beings. And let's look for these win-wins where, it genuinely can be better for everybody. I find that sort of both intellectually more coherent and hopefully it will actually drive more positive change too. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the only challenge we faced in that is to make sure that we kept foregrounding animal interest, because with so many actors, it's so easy. And it took us so long to even just map out, the whole space, because you open one end of it and there's sort of, 10 other things that appear, because it's so interconnected with so many different actors and so many different issues. So I think sort of being constantly, looking at it from also including an animal lens and not sort of like getting distracted by other sort of actions that would help people and planet, but not animals. I think that's something that, we have to think about quite a lot, with our group, to really make sure that we were constantly grounded in representing animal interests, and I'm going with that openness for all of the groups.
Yeah, that makes sense, because there's always this magnetic draw back towards an anthropocentric focus that we have to resist very clearly with that non-human animal lens too. Yeah. Well, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you. You've given me a sort of hopeful vision for how we might be able to drive a better future in various places around the world. Are there any other things you'd like to add into the conversation before I let you get on with your busy day and your multiple jobs? Because I think we've done a great job of answering what's real, what matters, and how to make a better world.
Yeah, no, I think it's been a really interesting conversation, sort of, going both into sort of like the deeper thinking and motivations behind some of our work, and also some of, the practical sides of it. It's been really enjoyable. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Well, what's the best way of people following you, supporting your work at Samayu and your other organizations? How can they find you, and how can they help? And I will include links in the show notes, but where would you point people to?
Sure. Samayu has social media presence on, I think, Facebook and Instagram. I'm on Twitter, so that it'd be great to engage with, anybody who's interested in this kind of work, in having more conversations about it. It's always sort of, it's always really good to get multiple perspectives and, sort of have more support, have more engagement, and more thinking, on these issues.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I would encourage all of my tiny audience to go and explore what you're doing, because it's fascinating work, and I think very distinctive for those who sort of come out of a global north perspective. So yeah, rich resources. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on Sentientist Conversations. Please stay in touch and keep you posted with progress.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure, Jamie. Thanks a lot.
Take care, Varda.